September 25th. While the Crusaders were slaughtering their civilian prisoners, Sultan Bayezid sent a message to Dogon Bey, the commander of the Nikopol garrison. The Sultan's message encouraged the commander to hold on a little longer as help was on the way. That night and the next morning, Bayezid prepared his forces for battle. He began by positioning his troops near the top of the hill. He organized his troops into the standard formation common for the time, following Turkish military traditions. The archers were in the first ranks. Lightly armored, their job was to launch volleys into the oncoming enemy, wearing them down as they trudged uphill. Behind the archers were the Sipahi, the Ottoman heavy cavalry. Heavily armed and armored, the Sipahi were the most important element of the Ottoman army. A Sipahi rode into battle covered in mail and armor while carrying a sword, bow and arrows, axe, and a warhammer. The Sipahi were proficient in all these weapons even while riding on horseback. Then came the infantry in the center of the Ottoman formation. In this battle, the infantry were positioned behind several rows of sharpened wooden stakes. Just like the archers in the front ranks, the infantry were lightly armored and expected to wear down the enemy. The Akinci, or Ottoman light cavalry, were stationed in front of the wooden stakes. These were fast, lightly armored horse archers. Their sole purpose was to harass, disrupt, and cause confusion in the enemy ranks. Though they were primarily archers, the Akinci also carried swords and other weapons for close combat. Mixed in with the infantry were the elite Janissary units. These slave soldiers were noteworthy for their discipline and loyalty to the Sultan. Regular infantry units were little more than cannon fodder, but not the Janissaries. They could inflict serious harm on the enemy and were expected to die for their Sultan. Finally, at the rear of the army, on the other side of the hill, out of sight of the Crusaders, was Sultan Bayezid and the Kapikulu. The Kapikulu were the cavalry version of the Janissary and the Sultan's personal guard. They were the last line of defense and even more ferocious than the Sipahi. Off to the side, in their own camp, was Prince Stefan Lazarevic and the Serbs. Sultan Bayezid held them in reserve, determined to use them only if absolutely necessary. The attack of the French and the Burgundians. It would be a mistake to assume the Crusaders did not have a plan. They certainly had an offensive plan and had spent all night arguing about it. King Sigismund and the Wallachians were familiar with the Ottoman battle style and knew what to expect. They suggested using their infantry to skirmish with the Ottoman archers, Akinci, and infantry. Just like the Ottoman infantry, the Crusader infantry was cannon fodder. They were basically peasants with swords. The Hungarians proposed using their infantry to absorb the brunt of the initial Ottoman attacks. This would weaken the Ottoman front ranks, making them easy targets for the Crusader heavy cavalry. Covered from head to toe in plate armor, there was nothing more terrifying than a European cavalry charge. The medieval version of a tank, the mounted knight could charge through the enemy ranks, scattering and slaying men left and right while barely taking any hits. The Hungarians knew this was the best strategy to defeat the Ottomans. But the French and the Burgundians would hear none of it. Once again, they scoffed at the Hungarians, whom they considered a lower class of people. The idea of riding into battle behind Hungarian and Wallachian peasants was ludicrous. Besides, the Western Europeans did not believe these Ottomans were as tough as the Hungarians made them out to be, nor did they believe the troop numbers their scouts had reported. They suspected King Sigismund proposed this plan so he could score an easy victory and grab all the glory. The Franco-Burgundians insisted on leading the initial charge and would not accept anything else. Despite his better judgment, King Sigismund relented and let them have their way. With that settled, the Crusaders formed up and began marching towards the Ottoman camp. The terrain was hilly and wooded, and it was slow going for most of the Crusaders. But not for the Franco-Burgundians. They were on horseback and moved faster than the other Crusaders, who were mostly on foot. The Hungarians also had cavalry, but King Sigismund preferred to keep them with his infantry. The quicker pace of the Franco-Burgundians divided the Crusader army into two segments. so they were the first ones to confront the Ottoman Akinci. Thinking the entire Ottoman force was made up of this light cavalry, the Franco-Burgundians charged forward, eager to get the fight started. But the Akinci were not there to fight. They shot a few arrows at the Crusaders, then scampered away into the woods. The Franco-Burgundians raced after them, eventually exiting the woods onto an open field at the bottom of a hill. Before them stood thousands upon thousands of Ottoman troops. As soon as they emerged from the woods, Ottoman archers began raining arrows down on them. But most of the arrows bounced off the Crusaders' heavy armor and padding. Their horses were not so lucky. Realizing they could not pierce the Crusader army, the Ottoman archers targeted the horses instead. This slowed the Franco-Burgundians down and took some of the wind out of their sails. But it did not stop them. They pushed up the hill towards the archers, who eventually scattered before them. The Franco-Burgundians finally reached the wooden stakes which stood between them and the Ottoman infantry. The Crusaders, who were still on horseback, dismounted and joined their comrades on foot. Together, they plowed through the sharpened stakes, some of them hacking away with their swords, while others wrenched them out of the ground with their bare hands. More annoyed by the archers and the stakes than anything else, the Franco-Burgundians took their wrath out on the Ottoman infantry. The infantry wore little armor and did not stand a chance against the metal-clad European warriors. The Crusaders tore through the infantry ranks, slaughtering everything in their path. The Ottoman infantry that survived this onslaught fled to the surrounding hills. Having made easy work of the first two levels of Ottoman defenses, the older Crusaders advised their men to rest and wait for the Hungarians to catch up. But the younger Franco-Burgundians were full of bloodlust and anxious for more action. They were getting closer to the main Ottoman camp and did not want to give them a chance to regroup. The young men shamed the older men for wanting to rest. The older Crusaders finally relented, and the Franco-Burgundians continued forward. They soon came face to face with the Ottoman Sipahis. The well-trained Sipahis encircled the Crusaders and closed in. The Crusaders should have listened to the older men. After fighting uphill in the hot sun while wearing heavy metal armor and padding, they had run out of gas, and the Hungarians were too far behind to be of any help. The Hungarians. Sultan Bayezid was surprised by the Crusaders' progress. They had blown through his archers and infantry, completely ruining his battle plan. But this was where Ottoman discipline proved vital. Though the archers and infantry had been routed by the Franco-Burgundians, they did not flee the battlefield. Instead, they regrouped, linked up with the Akinci light horsemen, and got back into the fight. The only part of Bayezid's plan that had worked so far was the encirclement of the Franco-Burgundians by the Sipahis. Bayezid could see the Hungarians rushing up the hill to help their fellow Crusaders. The Sultan ordered his Akinci and infantry to reform their lines and keep the Hungarians from catching up with the Franco-Burgundians. Meanwhile, despite being surrounded, the Franco-Burgundians were putting up a good fight against the Sipahis. Frustrated, the Sultan ordered his personal cavalry guard, the Capiculu Sipahi, to join the fray. The Capiculu rode down the hill at breakneck speed, crashing into the exhausted Crusaders. The Franco-Burgundians finally broke. Overmatched, overextended, and overwhelmed, the Crusader arrogance did them in. Some of them broke rank and fled into the woods. However, most of the Crusaders stood firm and fought to the death. Within minutes, it was all over, and the surviving Crusaders dropped their weapons and surrendered. Further down the hill, the Hungarian, Wallachian, Transylvanian, and German Crusaders ran into the reformed Ottoman lines of infantry and Akinci. The Wallachians and Transylvanians decided to call it quits. Perhaps they'd heard of the devastation taking place uphill. Perhaps they realized this was a lost cause. Perhaps they were afraid the Ottomans would seek retribution later. Whatever the reason, the Wallachians and the Transylvanians, who did not have a large military, could not risk losing troops in a meaningless battle. Sultan Bayezid observed the small Wallachian and Transylvanian army disengage and head for their ships on the river. But the Hungarians and the Germans pressed forward. The reformed Ottoman infantry and Akinci lines did their best to hold them back, but they were battered and bruised from their previous encounter with the Franco-Burgundians. Sultan Bayezid looked on in concern as the Hungarian Crusaders pushed his troops to the breaking point. He ordered some of the Sipahi to assist them, but it was still not enough. Almost all of the Sultan's available troops had been used. Almost. He ordered the Serbs to join the fight. His Serbian vassal, Stefan Lazarevic, led his troops down the hill to attack the Hungarian right flank. This proved to be too much for the Hungarians. They could not fight the Ottomans in front of them and the Serbs to their right at the same time. Their lines crumbled and fell apart. King Sigismund and most of the high-ranking Hungarian nobles fled the battlefield. They rushed back to their boats on the Danube River and set sail for home. But the vast majority of the remaining Hungarian and German troops were not so lucky. Thousands were slaughtered on the battlefield, and thousands more were taken prisoner. With the battle over, Sultan Bayezid made his way down the hill to inspect the Crusader camp at Nikopol. He was shocked by what he found.